Devolution, localism and austerity, thoughts from Leicester. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to Josh and the PSA for organising this event and for inviting me. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly than around the specific devolution question, and maybe introduce a slightly broader perspective on what localism is and what localism is about. I think the first thing to say, just taking the cue from Brian in mentioning Barcelona, is that whatever we make of localism and the policies for localism in this country, we still have very weak localism by comparison with regionally devolved countries like Spain and cities with a global profile like Barcelona, which have a range of powers that are not available to British municipalities or to cities like London with regards to taxation and deficit financing. Now that is very different, and it's also worth saying, I think, that under austerity in Spain, those powers have been constrained somewhat, so they're exemplars in Europe that I think we should look at to put our own localism in its context, but also recognise that there are spending squeezes going on, which mean that some of those historically powerful devolution models are also being constrained. But I think the point is that the way we think about localism makes a big difference, and it's useful to just step back and ask ourselves what is it really all about. Are we narrowly focused on devolution deals and the sort of institutional hodgepodge that's developing around devo deals, or is this a larger concern with how we run our towns and cities, which begs the question of what kind of political and financial powers our cities should actually have. So that's how I kind of frame my thinking around what's going on in Leicester and Leicestershire. Now, Leicester City decided to introduce the office of elected mayor in 2011. It did so without a referendum and decided for reasons that I don't really know, but they decided that the best approach for them was to have an elected mayor presiding over the city, and I think they broadly see that development to have been successful. The office holder is Sir Peter Soulsby, and Leicester is a Labour Party stronghold, and has been, apart from a brief period after the Iraq War. So this is the context in which the devolution issue is playing out in the city and the sub-region. Leicester and Leicestershire put forward a proposal, like some of the ones that we've heard about already, for a combined authority handling things like skills, transport, planning, economic development. Now that's been knocked back because the government is insisting that there should be a metro mayor for this combined authority. Now, what the government seems to be asking for is that there should be another mayor presiding over a special, what's basically a special purpose board, with the mayor of Leicester handling what's left of their governing function in the city, and at the same time you've got the latest version of the local economic development quango, the LEP, over here, which is not going to be part of the combined authority, and the LEP is then spending the funny money, including the funding streams from our now seemingly defunct membership of the EU. over which the city, the sub-region and the LEP itself has very little control anyway, because all these EU programmes are commissioned from the centre. So this is all a puzzle. Now, geographers like to talk about scale a lot and use the word scalar, which I don't know if that actually appears in the dictionary anyway. But geographers talk a lot about the scalar mess that constitutes the governance of the UK. Now, mess isn't necessarily bad. Doing things differently in different places makes a lot of sense sometimes. But what this seems to denote, this demand that there must be a metro mayor to preside over this combined authority, is a move from a scalar mess to scalar madness. And as Councillor Simon Galton, who's a Liberal Democrat councillor, said, either we will have an elected mayor nobody wants, or we won't get devolved powers that make it worth setting up a combined authority. It's not much of a choice. Well, it's not much of a choice, and no idea which way this is going to go, but this is where it is at this moment in time. So the question to put on the table there is, what kind of localism is that? Is this a kind of is it localism? Is it a kind of localism that anybody wants? Certainly, my understanding is that nobody in Leicester and Leicestershire wants this, for a whole series of reasons that I don't have time to go on to, some of which are obvious. So that's one thing. The devolution agenda in the Leicester and Leicestershire sub-region is on hold. Now, just to move off that topic, I think it's important to say that in the world of English local governance, there are some things that are not being localised but are being further centralised. And through doing research on austerity necessarily brings you to the matter of welfare reform. And it's very clear when you talk to people in the city that the city has absolutely no control whatsoever over what is happening in the sphere of welfare reform to thousands and thousands of people. So these reforms have a significant impact on the lives of tens of thousands of citizens in the city of Leicester, and they have no grip on this whatsoever, because the reform process is controlled by the Department of Work and Pensions. Now, this isn't a political point about whether this is good or bad. It is merely about saying that there are certain things that push in a localist direction and certain things that push in a centralising direction. And managing the fallout of welfare reform imposes serious costs. It's not just about money. It's about time, it's about labour, it's about reacting to things that are happening that are beyond your control. Councils and local voluntary organisations are constantly firefighting against the effects of welfare reforms and trying to pick up the pieces. So again, when we look at a huge area like welfare, how is the localism agenda playing out in relation to that? How should it play out? You know, these are the sorts of things that should be handled by mayors, or should they be handled by central government? Another aspect of this, which is very prominent in my own research on austerity, is what's happening to the relationship between local authority, voluntary organisations and citizens as a consequence of the recomposition of the voluntary sector. Now, I think this is fairly well known that the shift from grants to contracts favour large outside firms and charities. Big organisations with not necessarily any links at all to locality. And what we're seeing through the funding streams that come through the work programme and the local enterprise partnerships is that organisations that are variously called primes, majors or super majors are mopping up the vast majority of those funding streams, and some of it sometimes percolates down to local groups, but very often it doesn't. And it lists a lot of what's happening around the third sector and austerity and the way that government programs are funded leads me to ask a question like, are we looking at a new world of third sector multinationals here? Exercising an increasing degree of control over what local voluntary organisations used to do, because that's the way that the programmes are structured and funded. And so local voluntary organisations are under severe stress. Again, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know there. But what we're hearing is really, which is really interesting, is to do with the local fabric, the social fabric of the city. The capacity to engage local people, give them a voice, anticipate problems, span boundaries is seriously weakening. Now I have a quote here from somebody who ran a voluntary organisation which has lost its funding and is now being closed. And they said that all that's left of the, I won't say what the sector is for reasons of anonymity, but is a few single issue clubs and associations and a number of small volunteer-run, led and managed social groups, and here is the crucial bit, that do not have the means, capacity or capability to fulfil a link or communication function. In other words, the community no longer has a voice of any kind, it has nowhere to go. And this particular community is about 10% of the population of Leicester. So again, I think this poses interesting questions about the local and what we mean by localism and locality. And what these processes point to, I suggest, is the hollowing out of the local at the front line. So I could say an awful lot about this and make an awful lot more points about it, but I think those are three issues that I just wanted to flag up to try and bring a bit of grit, additional grit into the debate. So what can one conclude simply? Well, one, the terms of localisation seem to be set by Whitehall, Westminster, Whitehall. Bespoke devolution deals are messy. That's not a bad thing. Messiness isn't always bad, of course, but they aren't necessarily rational either. They can be quite bonkers. Well, what they look to be bonkers. Some aspects of local governance are being centralised in the sort of social policy field. The changing relationship between state and voluntary sector risks weakening local community networks and capabilities. All of which begs the question of what kind of localism is it that we are seeing, what kind of localist conjuncture are we in, and is it the kind of localism that towns and cities need and want? So I think I'll leave it there, other than to say this is where I come from. I run the Centre for Urban Research on Austerity at the Montfort University. We set up last year and expect to be here a long time. If not, we can change the A from austerity to abundance, but that's probably not going to happen. So anyway, that's me. Thank you very much.